Well, hello, everyone. Very warm welcome to this GovConnects session, one of many great events that have been organised to really help us spend a bit of time reflecting on some of the big issues of the day in the world of mental health. So I'm Paul Farmer, Chief Executive of Mind, really pleased to welcome you to this conversation this afternoon. It is the 1st of December, the beginning of the end of the year, probably a year that we're all very much thoroughly looking forward to ending as a result of all the real challenges that we face. So this is an opportunity for you to engage with us and ask questions through the chat, and also to maybe just reflect a bit on one of the really big issues that we're facing collectively in mental health, and that's the issue of how we tackle health inequalities. And in a moment, I'll set the scene on the kind of conversation that I hope we're going to have today. But also, I'm absolutely delighted that my co-pilot for this event is the absolute genius that is Jackie Dyer. Jackie, it's really lovely to see you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And I'm very delighted to be here with my fellow co-pilot on this journey around tackling inequalities in mental health. And yeah, really delighted. Let's just get on with it. Paul, if you could start off, that'd be great. Yeah.
Okay, let's crack on. So really please, as I said, please do use the chat to put in comments, questions. And the way we're going to go about this is I'm just going to make a few introductory comments, as is Jackie going to talk us through some of the thinking so far. And then I think we will have actually lots of time for us to talk about this this issue, because certainly in my experience, it's always the conversation that generates the richness of the discussion and the debate. So I promise we won't go on for too long, but we thought it would be useful for us just to set the scene. And my starting point to set the scene is actually to drag us all the way back to 2015. I think 2015, the launch of the 5-year full review, and it feels like a very, very long time ago now, doesn't it? And I've been chief executive at Mind now since 2006, but back then we were wanting to think about how we could encourage the government of the day to think more about mental health as a priority. And for those of you who have sufficiently long memories, the Prime Minister of the day was some bloke called David Cameron, if you remember him. And the newly installed Chief Executive of the newly formed NHS England was a guy called Simon Stevens. And in our conversations with ministers and with Simon, as a group of people from mental health charities and the mental health community, reflecting some of the real challenges that people were still facing and are still facing, of course, we really argued with people in power that a greater focus needed to be put on mental health in the round. And so Simon Stevens and ministers commissioned Jackie and I to co-chair the 5-year full review process for mental health. Now, we don't have to go into all the history of the 5-year full review, but please do, if you want to have a look at the document, it's there available on NHS's website and others. It contained 58 recommendations, which were all adopted by the government and the NHS. But when we were doing that work, and in the course of the journey that Jackie and I went through, where we spent a lot of time really listening to people with their own lived experience of mental health problems, consulted with thousands of people, asking people what they really wanted to address, the issue of inequality came up time and time again. Whether that was the experiences of black people in inpatient and secure settings, and I'm sure Jackie will remember this event we had with where we brought together an extraordinary event of people with who were in secure services. They came from all over the country and told us about their experiences and told us about the impact that inequalities had on their lives. And that kind of principle of wanting to address inequalities ran very deep through the recommendations that we made, and was very much a part of the approach that we wanted to take. And that, of course, in mental health, there are so many different inequalities. There are inequalities of experience, there's inequalities of access, there are inequalities of outcome, and of course there are very significant inequalities according to people's racial background, their financial background, and their wider experiences. So was a key part of the thinking that we put in place in the 5-year forward review for mental health. And as you'll know, many of you will know, the 5-year forward review for mental health has then been docked into the now NHS long-term plan. In fact, if you go to the 5-year forward review for mental health, way back on somewhere around page 72, it says, make sure that one of the key learnings for any document like this is you have to make sure you work on your successor document before you finish the previous document. And the long-term plan, the NHS long-term plan, absolutely delivers on that. On that, in terms of giving us a kind of program for the next few years, and the long-term plan runs up to 22, 23, 24. I'm just going to ask Jackie if she wouldn't mind muting. I think our sort of overall recognition on this was that the long-term plan now includes more resources for mental health, more commitment to tackling these issues around inequalities, and I'm going to hand over to Jackie in a minute to talk more about that. And those issues were embedded inside the plan for the long-term plan and the 5-year forward review before 2020, the terribly challenging year that we've all had. And what 2020 has done, I think, has shone a really powerful and uncomfortable light on racial inequality, whether that's the impact of what happened to George Floyd and the very strong and appropriate response from the Black Lives Matter movement has caused us all to think very carefully about the issue of racial inequality, but also the work that had already started to really think about how we tackle inequalities in a really systemic and embedded way. And the work that Jackie has done has really been to help us lead some of the thinking about what we should be doing. And just a few weeks ago, the Advancing Mental Health Equalities Strategy was published. And that document is what Jackie is going to talk us through. I think, are you still there, Jackie? You sort of appeared and reappeared. It looks like we've possibly lost Jackie for a minute. So we'll just carry on for a second and just kind of say a little bit more about some of the work that we've been thinking about in this context as Mind, where our work is, in terms of tackling inequalities, has always been a big part of work that we do as an organisation. And in the files, I think we've shared with you some of the particular challenges that we've spotted from the particular issues that people from Black and minority ethnic community and Asian and minority ethnic communities have been facing. And in that consideration, I think we've really thought particularly about the experiences that communities have faced when it comes to accessing services, issues around stigma around mental health amongst particular communities, the kind of interface between the mental health system and the criminal justice system. And in fact, today we're talking publicly about the implementation of a new piece of legislation, which has now been waiting for implementation for some time, Shenny's Law, which was produced as produced as a result of the experiences of Olaseni Lewis, who died in a mental health unit, and the law has changed, but it hasn't yet been implemented. So we know there's work to be done in this area, and I think one of the most important aspects of this has been for us to kind of form the support for the Advancing Mental Health Equalities work, because it it's really important, I think, that we all back and support the plans and intentions of this area. So I'm now going to ask Jackie to say a few words about that. I know you've got some slides as well, Jackie, haven't you, just to kind of bring that to life. Just want to hand over to you just to say a bit about the thinking and where it is, where you've got to.
Okay, hi. I think I dropped off for a little bit, Paul. I don't know what happened, so I've just logged back in. So I might be repeating some of the last points that you've sort of like been making, but wanted to thank you for being my core collaborator on this journey that's brought us to this point, and to welcome indeed the audience in participating in this session. And I kind of want to, before I sort of go into some of the more recent policy and practical moves that we've been making, actually just go back a touch before in this journey and speak about the Mental Health Act review, which took place, well, exactly the years roll into one, but I think we reported in 2018, the latter part of 2018. And just to remind people that one component of that Mental Health Act review, or at least 2 out of the 6 terms of reference for the Mental Health Act review, was to look at the rising levels of detention under the Mental Health Act, and to look at the overrepresentation of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. And I was quite clear that in order to do that most robustly, is that we needed to have subgroups to the Mental Health Act advisory panel that could focus with laser-like precision on actually the experience of African and Caribbean communities, and then subsequently Asian and minority ethnic communities and other subgroups that actually then targeted particular aspects that we wanted to penetrate upon in terms of developing the recommendations for the Mental Health Act review that would inform the government's white paper, which they are proceeding on developing now. And within that context, I co-chaired the African and Caribbean Working Group, known as the MARAC. And proceeding, so I just want to give you a sense of progression on this journey. These things do not just happen overnight. There is very much standing on the shoulders of the shoulders that went before us. It's a cumulative and incremental journey that at certain points there are catalysts to say that we need to further sharpen our saw on this journey, which we've experienced in terms of the impact of COVID and the sort of global recognition of the impacts and the cumulative impacts of systemic racism. So at the same time as we published February 2016, the 5-year forward view for mental health, we also published the CRISP Commission, which was the recommendations on the shortage on inpatient beds within the mental health sector. And there was a recommendation in there that we cultivated really very, very clearly. And in fact, I remember being inspired by the Workforce Race Equality Standard when we were developing that, a recommendation to respond to the overrepresentation of Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities within inpatient setting. And the CRISP Commission spoke about that so profoundly. And so I thought about the Workforce Race Equality Standard, and I thought, actually, don't we need something that speaks from the position of the patient and carer, not from the position of the workforce, but actually a standard, a framework that is led from the perspective of the patients and the carers that we serve. So actually honoring the feedback that patients and carers can give in a equality improvement kind of style to help us to further improve mental health services. And that's where the patient and carer race equality framework standard emerged from within the CRISP Commission. And we, within the 5-year forward view, also took on board that was a a recommendation that we wanted to support. Unfortunately, it's taken a long time for that one to actually unfold. And I made sure that when chairing the co-chairing the Mental Health Act Review African and Caribbean Working Group, that I brought that recommendation forward as to assist with attending to this issue, and that was supported by the wider Mental Health Review Advisory Panel as one as our recommendations. And additional to that was another recommendation, culturally appropriate advocacy, which was also agreed by the panel as being key to helping to transform mental health services in the best interest of people who hold the protected characteristic of race. So I suppose I want to lay that context also, so that one realizes that the effort that goes into co-creating and creating where we are now is an ongoing and persistent journey of attention, and we're at a tipping point in terms of really manifesting to our optimal level taking the next steps forward. And one of the and so with the Mental Health Act review, two of those recommendations, the Patient and Carer Race Equality Framework, otherwise known as the PCREF, an acronym, you know what I mean, and the culturally appropriate advocacy were agreed by government prior to the white paper being created as it is at this moment. So those recommendations were being taken forward. The PCREF being led in terms of its national development via NHS England, and I chair that steering group. And the culturally appropriate advocacy is something that we are hopeful that both government will continue to help to support, but actually up and down across the country, organisations, local authorities, ICSs, etc., will take forward that recommendation with the urgency that is required of that in order to provide the checks and balances and support to helping support people when they are at the most vulnerable, especially when they are coming from racialized communities. There could be no clearer indication of the urgency of that than what we've just experienced in this year, 2020. So hopefully one will understand that. So it's within that context that the Advancing Mental Health Task Force has emerged, and Paul has eloquently talked about that history. And I hope that he's said that he chairs one of the boards or groups that the Advancing Mental Health Equalities Task Force reports to, i.e. the implementation and oversight group for both the 5-year forward view and the long-term plan. Equally, the task force reports to the Mental Health Programme Board, which is chaired by Claire Murdoch. So that indicates to you all the commitment that is evident from NHS England and its partners around this agenda. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And it's with great pleasure that I say to you that the Advancing Mental Health Equality Strategy, which was published in mid-October this year, really articulates a lot of the work that we've been doing to date, but also a lot of the work that we'll be doing going forward. And so when you look at the key objectives of the strategy, you will see that its key components, the work streams, are around supporting local systems to advance mental health equalities, of which continuing to support the development of the PCREF is one element, investing in transformation to support advancing mental health equalities, making sure that we have much more robust sharing of evidence as it emerges, and supporting the development of the provider collaboratives impact framework, whereby the advancing mental health equalities agenda is intrinsically immersed, as is the Peacock. They're all one and the same thing. And improving our data quality and use is another key work stream. We all know that we've not yet optimized our use and of the mental health minimum data set. We drastically need to improve this in order for us to really fulfill even our duties under the Equalities Act, whereby to support people who hold protected characteristics. If you don't have the data, how can you do that? What intelligence are you using in terms of your data to support intelligent thinking and co-creation of appropriate responses to people who are holding those protected characteristics and the intersectionalities therein? So there's a lot of work that we are doing nationally around supporting systems to improve that data. But equally, it's about everybody, wherever you're located, wanting to use data much more robustly to help shape the conversations and the thinking about how you're going to transform and improve services, and how that information actually supports your co-production or co-learning efforts wherever you're located in this equality improvement journey. And another key element of the strategy is around the workforce, both in terms of ensuring that we've got a representative workforce across the hierarchy of mental health service provision, but also making sure that the workforce is fit for the purpose of supporting people who have who hold protected characteristics and the intersectionality therein, so that people are more confident in being able to advance mental health equalities. And I cannot reinforce how important that is during this time, when you look at the disproportionate impacts of COVID on people who come from, who hold different protected characteristics. It's been significant around people who are from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities that are disproportionately died in the early stages, in particular from COVID, and in terms of their access to support has been disproportionate. And then you can see how that's also played out in mental health provision, in terms of supporting psychological needs and so forth. And how can we sort of really believe in these times that one size fits all? It's never the case. How can that be? The sort of like a delusion almost, that doing things, even with all the best of intentions, in one way that may cater for a bulk of a proportion of a population, but actually some of those that experience their worst vulnerabilities are not getting that sort of care which it is that they need. And to really understand that if you are living in situations where your income, your housing, your employment, all these different things that make up the social determinants of your experience, and therefore, depending how they manifest, actually give you a whole spectrum of risks in relation to your mental health, or contributing to your mental health vulnerabilities, then we would understand that certain communities that are experiencing these structural inequalities, these multiple disadvantages, these multiple discriminations, are highly more at risk, and they're of mental health, severe mental illness, mental health challenges, mental emotional distress, as they're trying to survive, navigating through what is essentially ongoing crisis. And then on top of that, we've got COVID. And so are our services really fit for the purpose of supporting people with these kind of lived experiences? I say that because that's what I have to navigate day in, day out in my own life. And I know services haven't been fit for the purpose of taking care of my needs and my family's needs. So it's with that sort of real lived experience that I also lead in attending to this journey. The next slide, please. So the patient and carer race equality framework, which we're co-producing and co-developing from an NHS England perspective, and actually embracing the whole country in helping us to shape this framework. It's very exciting work. We've got 4 pilot sites that are really closely helping us to develop this, what will be a national framework. And that is our partners are Birmingham and Solihull Mental Health Trust, Greater Manchester, East London, and South London and Maudsley. And they are part of our steering group. And the steering group is made up of people with lived experience, both as carers and as patients of mental health services, people of lived experience of a racialized experience, and a range of stakeholders, statutory and voluntary sector and community sector partners. And a similar representation is also held of the Advancing Mental Health Equalities Task Force. And that sort of cross-cutting energy also makes the co-creation of an Advancing Mental Health Equality strategy and the co-creation of this particular framework really exciting, because it gives us an ability to get closer to what are the real dynamics and challenges that are happening in these spaces that we really want to respond to. And if I sort of like describe the key components of the PCREF, but firstly articulate the aim of the PCREF, to improve Black, Asian and minority ethnic patient and carer experiences within mental health services by developing core organizational competencies. And at the center of the PCREF, and I think most importantly, is the feedback tool, a patient and carer feedback mechanism, which supports almost helping to benchmark, because you're listening to the patient and carer feedback about whether or not these transformations, these changes, these improvements are actually making even any bit of difference to the patient and carer experience and the community's experience of mental health service provision. And I think what we've wanted to do, building on the Mental Health Act review, building on our pilot sites, building on some of the deep dives that we've been doing in relation to Black, Asian and mental health experiences within mental health service pathways, engaging, and as we are, and it's an ongoing engagement with patients and carers and communities on the potential competencies, and there are ongoing engagements regionally and nationally taking place with all parts of the system, stakeholders, commissioners, service providers, patients, carers and communities, is that we've got some key components of the PCREF that we've identified. And part one is the statutory and regulatory obligations. So if you almost think of this as sort of like a transparent accountability framework in a way, right? And these are the key components of that. And how do mental health providers or agencies actually populate these areas? How do you provide the evidence to say that you are on this journey and that you can almost baseline as you're making these improvements? So the part one, statutory and regulatory obligations, outline the bare core statutory and regulatory obligations which trusts are really already trying to fulfill around human rights, around the Equality Act, around the Mental Health Act, the implementation of the Mental Health Act, around the Workforce Race Equality Standard, around the Use of Force Act, and the guidance around that, around CQC inspections, and improving that somewhat further. We're doing work around that within the task force around the criteria for well-led, and about how we strengthen that around equalities. And actually that then supports mental health service provision around their work in this area. So there are the part one, statutory and regulatory obligations. What is the evidence that all providers can provide here from a racialized perspective that they're making this improvement journey, right? So that's one component. Organizational competencies. These are both national organizational competencies, and these are based on the work that we've done thus far. Some of the key areas, the key competencies that if you pay attention to, you work through these competencies in your organizations, you will be able to develop ways of improving the racialized experience. We're not telling you how to do that. We're saying that you need to attend to that, to those areas of competencies. And what an amazing thing it will be going forward, that when all of that great practice that is already unfolding, that will unfold, that you'll be able to share up and down the country of good practice around these competencies that actually can start providing evidence of how the patient experience, carer experience, and community's experience of mental health services are improving from a racialized perspective. And the next slide, please. So these are some of the competencies. We will be taking these out to a national survey, a national consultation, where all parts of the country will be able to engage. We've already started a series of webinars around these. Currently, some of the key competencies that people think are really, really important are around cultural awareness, around leadership and governance, around co-production and co-learning, and staff knowledge and awareness. These are some of the ones that are surfacing as being some of the most important ones of the competencies that we've identified. And people actually thus far really like all of these competencies as ones they want to really pay attention to and believe and feel confident that these would help that within their organization, if they had coordinated efforts around what work can we do around this. And actually, when you think about, for example, co-production, how might you interact co-production and your use of data? How might you use co-production and cultural awareness? They can be interactive also, and then they interact also with the statutory and regulatory obligations. So actually, some of the data that you have from your statutory and regulatory obligations speak to a competency about better use of data to inform your leadership and governance, to inform your co-production, to inform your partnership working, to inform and improve the workforce competencies around working with working with people when they're at their most vulnerable, but whom are also from racialized communities. So I'm really excited about this. Actually, there's a lot of excitement around, and it's like, wow, we are in a moment that actually we can really do something that potentially can really, really work. And it's absolutely so exciting. So these will be some of the national organizational competencies. It may well be that in your locality, these ones, alongside these ones, you might want to add additional local organizational competencies, and then you would go on to develop some work around that. But keenly, what we want right across the country is that everybody is attending to the same areas so that there is less variation in the level of experience and commitment to transforming the mental health service provision for people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic community. We have to build trusting relationships with those communities that mean that they less come to us from a position of fear at a point of crisis. And actually, nobody wants to come into the services because they fear that when they come in, they die. I heard mention of Olaseni Lewis, Rocky Benny. The names are too, Sean Rigg. There's too many to mention in terms of a very detrimental and negative racialized experience. I speak personally when I say that my own siblings, and I have 3 siblings who have diagnosis of severe mental illness, and 2 of them are dead already, having been in mental health service provision for 30 odd years. My second brother died a week after George Floyd this year. And I think it's really important to be honest about the reality of that liberty. My siblings never experienced a competent, culturally competent mental health service provision that gave them what they needed in order for them to feel have a more thriving and flourishing existence. Their experience revolved around, oh, how can we make your how can we improve your medication? Not how can we get you access to psychological therapies, not how can we support you into employment, not how can we make sure that you've got an advocate that really gets you, that can actually negotiate on your behalf, not a peer support person that could understand the reality of your lived experience, therefore walk alongside you in your journey, in your healing journey. No, that's not what they experience. And I constantly live in this anxiety. I've got 2 siblings that have passed now with a mental health service provision that hasn't benefited them. And I've got 1 sibling, and I'm like panicking that that sibling is also going to pass. We significantly have to improve what it is that we're doing. And we have an opportunity with this framework to do that, so that any part of the country where people who live racialized experience actually exist, that actually they are receiving an equality of outcomes similar to other people, an equity of outcomes similar to other people that are experiencing mental health provision, and that is of the highest standard, which doesn't discriminate and oppress them when they are at their most vulnerable. Next slide, please. You're going to receive these slides, and these are some of the timescales, but what I'd like to do is move on so that we can have some time for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. I think I always, whenever I listen to you speaking, I think first of all, I'm always super impressed by what you have to say, but particularly, I think the message I hear so often from you, quite rightly, is that, is the opportunity that this moment creates, and the sort of sense that, whilst we're nowhere near where we would need to be, there is a chance, probably the best chance that we've had for a very long time, to really make a difference to people's experiences. And I think that's a really key part of what we're about. So thank you. And that framework is, as you said, it's got the full backing of the NHS and NHS mental health services and the NHS system. So, there's a shared responsibility here. It's not all on your shoulders or anybody else's shoulders. It's on our collective shoulders to get this right. So just to say, first of all, that these, as Jackie's rightly said, the slides are available in this marvellous system that we have here. There's a little icon with marked slides, and Jackie's slides are in there, so you can access those. There's also quite a lot of useful content in the files section, which just gives you, the more in terms of the actual document that Jackie was referring to, amongst other things. So this is the time really to open this up into a conversation, and thank you very much. We've already had a couple of really helpful questions and comments into the chat. So please do keep doing this. So I'm just going to start with a couple of people. Let's just talk a little bit about COVID, shall we? So the first question from Ronald Mendel about for you, Jackie, actually, is how has COVID pandemic complicated efforts to eradicate mental health inequalities? And I guess to some extent also, how is it going to help?
So I think what COVID has done is sort of exposed, as we all know, the inequalities in terms of its disproportionate impact that already exists. And whereas before, I think that people kind of swept it under the carpet, it's quite difficult to surface these kinds of discussions. Like in this time, it's unavoidable not to surface these discussions, but equally, it's also exacerbated the inequalities. So when you look at that in terms of like vulnerability or increasing risk factors in terms of mental health challenges, you can see that there are rising levels of anxiety and depression, and those people who already have mental health challenges, that these levels are rising. There's rising levels of referrals to crisis services. There are people trying to access support via counselling, bereavement, all kind of trying to access support, coming in at all kind of different angles. But I think one of the things that it exposes is that we can't keep offering the support in the same way that we're accustomed to offer it. We have to be much more creative and dynamic. So when we think about, for example, statutory provision standard, statutory provision on its own is not the way kind of like forward. It emphasizing doing things in partnership with the voluntary sector, with community group, for this kind of more dynamic, different models of responding to people's needs to be kind of like cultivated. And I think that's one of the things that the PCREF kind of like identifies. And furthermore, we have to look wider and earlier at the makeup of the social determinants of mental health. So for me, I am also a cabinet member for job skills and community safety, and very much I'm attending to the components around economic resilience and how do you create systems that people can access in order to lead to more flourishing lives. And that's made even more urgent as a result of the disproportionate impacts of people being on universal credit, being unemployed. We had 8,000 unemployed this time last year in Lambeth. This time it's like 20-odd thousand. You cannot understand the scale of impacts of COVID unless you're really quite close to the ground in other settings, sometimes outside of mental health service provision. And then that helps you to understand what might be needed in terms of a more creative kind of set of offers to respond to people where they really are. And in Lambeth in particular, what we're talking about is disproportionality in terms of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, children and young people, intersecting with children and young people and intersecting with women. This is where the fallout is really, really taking place, and people with disabilities. So how do we collectively, collaboratively really respond to some of those challenges if we want to collectively really improve outcomes? So for me, these are opportunities to actually help to attend to that really quite harsh reality. Yeah,
thanks. Lots of questions coming in. Thank you. That's really, really great to see so many questions. So Sharan Dhaliwal asks about whether mental health is now on the back burner as health, increasingly focuses towards the vaccine for COVID. And I mean, I think my sense is that there's always a risk that when other things take priority, that mental health takes a bit of a step back. But I do think that in the course of this year, collectively, we've really reinforced a lot of messages about the mental health dimension of coronavirus, whether that's for people with existing mental health problems or people who are at risk of developing mental health problems, or indeed to some extent the wider public, because I think, probably all of us have had to pay a bit more attention to our own mental health during this time, as we've been required to do things like self-isolation, which are not really terribly good things for our mental health. So I think it is it is still up there, and I think we were pleased to see both the publication of the mental health winter plan by the government, which shows a kind of recognition of some of the urgent issues that services are facing, but also the allocation of an additional £500 million in the spending review for mental health services. And I think that kind of suggests certainly that, to me at least, that this is still visible as an important issue for government and certainly in the NHS. But we always have to be careful and make sure that we continue to have that conversation and make sure that mental health remains really, really high. And just connected to that, Sharon makes a point, Jackie, about stigma as well. And we have another question about the kind of about stigma in the context of mental health. I just wonder whether you just might want to say a little bit about the extent to which stigma has played a role. Stigma around mental health has played a role in the context of Black communities. And I was thinking about the work we did, the 300 Voices work we did as part of the Time to Change campaign a few years ago, which really shone a light, didn't it, on work that you can do to tackle stigma within those communities. So you just want to add a bit more to that?
I think that when we talk about stigma, we have to think that actually stigma is located in all communities in relation to mental health, and it just manifests itself differently across cultures, or it's described differently as well across cultures. So there's something about actually, on the one hand, in relation to stigma, but on the other hand, looking to learn about the languages around how people talk about emotional distress and mental health in different communities. There is much to learn from the East, the West, the North, the South around emotional health, because essentially that's actually what we're really talking about. And I think sometimes the stigma arises from a sort of standard medical definition of mental health, which is located around a kind of disorder kind of thing. And actually, myself, I think I'm not disordered. I don't hold any disorders. So I get really quite tangled up in terms of my own learning difficulty. I'm dyslexic and dyspraxic. And then I look at my own sort of mental health challenges and I think I haven't got anxiety disorder. I'm just stressed, So sometimes you can get really caught up in the language, and that adds another layer of stigma, when actually sometimes it's about exploring in different ways what some of the challenges are and really listening to how people explain their trauma and their distress. So I think some of the and then to look at so for me, stigma is held in all communities in relation to mental health, and stigma is held in a society where actually the value is placed upon economics, or I don't want to get political, but a kind of neoliberal individual kind of something, right? Then our humaneness and our connection with one another are sort of like undervalued. And so the human components around our physical and emotional and mental health are devalued, and it's sort of cultivated that it's quite shaming to talk about your vulnerabilities, which is one of the reasons I challenge myself to kind of share my own vulnerabilities as a way of sort of role modeling that it's okay. It helps us to have a different kind of conversation. So I think, looking at the stigma across cultures and stigma in relation to when people have severe mental health challenges is something that we have to continue to explore and to address, because the compounded factor, for example, of being a man with some mental health challenges who's sort of Black and maybe additional disabilities, creates an intersectionality of stigmas that is of a profound and terrible nature in terms of how society responds to you. And we see that kind of manifestation right across different mental health and actually in the wider society, the different components of employment, housing, education, where all these kind of stigma and barriers and stereotypes mean that people can't flourish. So we have to make additional effort about how we support people with these intersectionalities.
And that takes us into a couple of comments that people are making in the chat about social prescribing. So Chris Manning, very good question about the role of social prescribing. And we also have another question in the chat about how much from Riddhi Prajapati. Thank you very much, Riddhi, for this kind of understanding about how we embed less medicalizing trauma-informed approaches in addressing social determinants. And I think, very good question, how can culture be shifted from power over and othering to co-creation and being with? And I think we both feel very strongly that is exactly the agenda that we're trying to pursue at the moment. So, we know that there's a recognition across the NHS of the importance of a much more kind of holistic view to supporting people, and there's a big program of investment in the long-term plan around kind of changing the community mental health pathway, which I think takes a really more welcome kind of approach to thinking not just about clinical needs, but thinking about social needs and kind of the needs that people might have in their mental health journeys. And then at the local level, I think and at the national level, we're increasingly seeing, this spirit of co-creation and co-production becoming a reality. It's slow, it's not quick enough by any stretch of the imagination, but I guess, Jackie, what you're trying to stimulate in the PCREF is that whole idea that when you're at a local level, when you're wanting localities to work on this, you get people from different communities round the table. You start with those national kind of competencies, but you actually say, what do we need as a local community? That's the kind of energy that we're trying to unlock, isn't it?
Yes. So it's like, these are the national competencies. How do we create that at a local level? How do we co-create that at a local level? It's actually not very difficult. And I often think to myself, why are we making this? Why would we make this so hard? And in fact, what would be the resistance? What's the resistance to actually doing what is really not very difficult? And that's when, for me, I start, wow, systemic racism is a heavy, heavy duty thing, boy, because the resistance to doing that which might get to a better outcome by always identifying the barriers rather than looking at, okay, these are the barriers, how can we overcome them with some of the opportunities or some of the solutions, and how can we co-create those solutions together? How can we be much more imaginative and dynamic in that? Is actually what we really want to sort of cultivate, the confidence that can be done. And I think that when we think about co-production and co-creation, I think that what we have to do is and co-learning, for example, we have to really not pigeonhole ourselves in a box about, it's about getting people round a meeting table once a month. It's actually a whole range of ways that we can do co-production. We can do it in a much more dynamic kind of a way. Not everybody wants to sit around a meeting table on a Skype call on a Friday afternoon or a Friday morning. And actually, those that are more able to attend that, what about those that are excluded from being able to attend to that? Those might be the very ones that actually we need to get some feedback or some sort of tune into. And they might be using a whole lot of other mechanisms that we're not accessing. And how might we do that? How might we find ways to get connected to that? Is often what sometimes I think we do a bit what's easiest rather than that which is a bit more difficult and actually requires us to be a bit more effortful in our thinking rather than automatic.
Yeah, really good point. Okay, we're getting loads of questions, and of course we are now inevitably running out of time. So we're going to go for quick. This is the quick fire round, Jackie.
I can't see the questions.
So Dory, it's all right. I can, so that's all right.
All right. Okay.
So Dorian Hallam says, I'm working as an OT, developing a competency frame package for my OTAs, OT assistants, I'm guessing. Would you advocate me including the equalities competencies as part of my teaching to them?
Wonderful. That's the way to go. Get down on the Peacock, get down on that. And I look forward to hearing from your good practice. So what I would be expecting actually is from each of the disciplines, mental health disciplines, how you might think about that as being, how you might think about these competencies in improving your service, your care, but thinking about from each of the services. So what do these competencies look like in IAP services? What do these competencies look like in community mental health services? What do these competencies look like in inpatient services? What do they look like in perinatal services? What do they look like across the whole mental health provision? What evidence could you say in terms of, which is what this OT is saying, in terms of the workforce from an OT perspective? How are we demonstrating these competencies? And most essentially, I think that to support you, the leadership and governance of the whole mental health trust provision needs to own this agenda, and that it's systematic in its approach to pulling together this the evidence and support in this accountability framework.
Right. Toby Williamson makes a really important point about tackling other inequalities. So these ambitions go beyond issues around race inequalities, don't they? So the kind of a lot of the themes of principles here are covers a whole range of inequalities, and of course there's significant intersectionality. Susan Turner asks a question about work and work capability in the context of the kind of PCREF, which I'll perhaps ask you just to answer before we finish. There's some brilliant, thank you for everyone who's shared your own experiences. That's really, really appreciate those of you who have done that. And also some of the big challenges. So Fiona's point about schools in relation to mental health, are we doing enough there? Well, I think probably the short answer to that is no, but more to do. Thank you to those people who have made broader comments about how we can get this working collectively and in a shared way. So in the last couple of minutes that remains, Jackie, if you want people to take away one thing from today, what would you really like people to do?
Embrace these the PCREF and the Advancing Mental Health Equality Strategy, and look at how you can start acting on that from wherever you're located, and start having those conversations so that you can make this a practical reality that helps to transform people's lives. And to appreciate the point, the PCREF came as a result of the significant distortions and overrepresentations of the racialized experience. But equally, one has to recognize you don't have race that sits aside from your gender and your disability or your sexuality. These things are intersectional experiences, but the PCREF leads from a position of race, and focusing on this mechanism will assist us to improve all equality experiences and address the inequities that are very disproportionately evident in our systems. So start to take action and use these frameworks and tools to start having those conversations to advocate for these actions.
And for me, just thank you very much to everyone for your participation. But I think for me, my sense is that, we've got a strong bedrock to build on in terms of policy and investment and support and interest in mental health. And although this year has been hugely challenging for everyone, I think when we come out the other side, come out into next year, I think it feels to me as though this is going to be a really critical year for mental health, and the way in which we achieve the real changes that we want to make which benefit everybody will be by a really strong sense of collaboration and working differently. I think, you know, working in a way that opens doors to people, allows people in to help co-create and share some of these solutions. You know, I think we know that one of the great positive effects of the last period has been people beginning to connect better with their local communities, and I think we've got a real opportunity to build on that for people's mental health over the next year as well. So thank you very much for your attendance. Thanks for your contributions, and just say a massive thank you to Jackie for her wisdom and insight as ever. And we look forward to seeing you on another one of these sessions. Thank you very much to colleagues at GovConnect for making it happen.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.